Now to today's lecture. Hervé Lemahieu is the director of the Asian Power Diplomacy Program at the Lau Institute in Sydney. He joined the Lau Institute, the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies, where he is the research associate for political economy and security specialising in Southeast Asia. In an earlier role at Oxford Analytica, he consulted on early warning and geopolitical risk for governments and international organisations. He has a Master of Science in Global Governance and Diplomacy from the University of Oxford and a Master of Art with First Class Honours in International Relations and Modern History from the University of St Andrews. His work analysis and quantifies shifts in the geo-economics, military balance and diplomatic networks of Asia. Among other projects, Hervé leads the research for the annual Asia Power Index, which was launched by the Lau Institute in 2018, which is a data-driven assessment that he developed to map the changing distribution of power in the region. His commentary and analysis have appeared in a significant number of media outlets and publications. So would you please welcome to the podium this afternoon, Hervé.
Thanks very much, by the way. All right, let me just get set up. Thanks very much for that very warm introduction and welcome. I will just get set up with my slides here. Hopefully that will work. The problem with high-tech presentations is that lots of things can go wrong, but so far so good. Oh, we've already started. There we go. Let me just zoom back a bit. Right. So, I work at the Lowy Institute, and my job is rather abstract, which is to try to make sense of how the distribution of power or the balance of power in our region is changing, how quickly and in whose favor, why, what are the strengths and weaknesses of every country. So this is a huge mission, and we've been working on this for about 2 years, and it involves understanding things like military capability, but also things like economic relationships, resilience, cultural influence, media flows. So this is a very data intense exercise, and the challenge has been to try to find data that can substantiate our assumptions that China is rising, or that the US may be declining, or that Australia may be stagnating. We talk about these sorts of things all the time in generalities, but we don't often see how that works in practice in terms of data. So I'll make a few observations using an analytical tool which we at the Lowy Institute have developed over the course of several years, and that's called the Asia Power Index. And that will allow us to think through what might happen to the distribution of power globally as we move from what I argue was an open and consensual liberal world order following of the collapse of the Soviet Union back to something defined more by competition between the greatest powers, certainly between the United States and China. So we may even be moving back in the direction of a new Cold War between the two largest players, and that will have important consequences for Australia and for our region. So I'll make 3 points. First is that I think under most scenarios, short of war, the United States will not be able to halt the narrowing power differential between itself and China. That is to say that China is leveling with the United States. It's a question of when, and not if, China basically becomes a co-equal superpower in our region. The US may remain the global power, but China may very well become the predominant power in our region. Second, I think globalization, which is the process of economic interdependence that has really held since the the end of the Cold War, globalization will continue to exist. It will continue to involve the biggest actors like Australia, the US, and China, but increasingly will involve less and less of US and China together. That is to say, they will trade with other countries, other countries will trade with US and China, but US and China together, bilaterally, will do it less and less trade. And that will mean a more hazardous variant of globalization, dominated potentially by spheres of economic influence. And third, I think the third point I want to make is that middle powers in our region, but also further afield in Europe, will become crucial in the overall balance between two gridlocked superpowers, the US and China. Middle powers will have to find an intermediary role between China and the US. They will have to manage great power rivalry in ways that they haven't had to do for a long time. And this will really put Australia and others to the test in years and decades to come. But fundamentally, I don't think we will see fixed blocks in the way that the last Cold War was run, where we could talk about mutually exclusive spheres of economic and security alliances. I think the point is the world is too interconnected. We may be an ally of the United States in a military sense, but we will continue to have an economic relationship with China. We cannot afford to decouple entirely from China. So the world gets a bit more complicated. But let me begin with a little bit of history, because it's worth reminding ourselves just how quickly the world has changed, even in the last 2 or so decades. In 1995, the largest global economies were the United States, followed by a series of its treaty allies. 4 of the world's 5 largest economies were transatlantic. And it's staggering to see just how Asia's economic transformation, has shifted the economic power globally in the last 2 decades. So if I press play here, what I'm doing is actually fast forwarding from 1995, the relative GDP, so the size of every country's economy against each other. So hopefully that works. And here we go. Okay, it's moving. We've got movement. So what you see here is actually on the right-hand side, the years go by from 1995. And what you see is that China went from about an economy the size of Spain, quickly surpassed France and Germany in the mid-2000s. By 2009, became the second largest economy globally, surpassed Japan in second place. And since then has continued to race against the US as its only sort of economic competitor. India, a bit more of an economic laggard, but in the last decade has also experienced an economic sort of miracle of its own. And to such an extent that by 2023, the IMF expects India to be the 5th largest economy globally. So this isn't just the rise of China, this is the rise of a number of others. And there are actually 2 ways of looking at the size of economies here. This is at market exchange rates, so gross domestic product at market exchange rates. If we consider it at using another method, which is at purchasing power parity, this is the idea that China can build more skyscrapers for less money than the US can, because things are cheaper there, labor costs are cheaper, then China is already a larger economy than the US by about a third. India is the 3rd largest economy, and even Indonesia is about as big as Germany. We would expect it to be by 2023. So again, that's how quickly things have changed since 1995, where in 1995 the 4 of the 5 largest economies were transatlantic, so the US followed by some of its European allies. By 2023 we'd expect the top 5 players, 4 of the top 5 players to be in the Indo-Pacific region. That includes the US there as well. The only European player left in the top 5 is Germany. So there we go. In geostrategic terms, it's the relativities that matter. And China's rise, its economic rise at least, by definition imposes costs for the US as the incumbent world power.
Where will we be in 23?
You're somewhere, I think it's Australia somewhere in, let me just have a look. You're making sure that you're not, we're just below 20, I think. We're probably 22 or sort of in the overall. But this is by market exchange rates. If I go by GDP, where is this? Yeah, Australia is 13th. There you go. So we're reassuringly still in top 20 at market exchange rates, not at purchasing power parity, unfortunately. Now, let's see where we are here. Yeah, I should stress that the US is not in absolute decline. There's a difference between relative decline and absolute decline. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with the US's power. It's not going to collapse like the Roman Empire. It's simply that others are rising and they're rising faster, and that presents challenges for the US as a world power. Now, it's not just economic resources that matter for our conceptualization of power. We think there are at least 8 thematic distinctions to be made when assessing a country's state power. So I'm just going to move here. So as you can see, there's economic resources. There is military capability, so every country's autonomous military strength. There is what we call resilience, which is the capacity of every country to deter potential threats to their stability. There are future trends, which is the projected distribution of economic, military and demographic resources into the future. But we're actually using 2030 as our horizon here. Why is that important? Because it already affects perceptions of power today. Power is not just what you have now, it's also what you may have tomorrow, and it's also perceptions based. The fact that we think that China is rising, but maybe even more powerful tomorrow, already sort of informs our assessment of China's overall clout today. But it's not just what countries have, it's also what they do with what they have, in terms of how they invest in diplomatic networks, in terms of how their economic relationships are wired, in terms of how their defense networks augment their autonomous military strength. So the idea that alliances can be force multipliers when used wisely and when relationships are invested in. And then finally, but certainly not last in terms of its importance, we have cultural influence, which is the ability of countries to shape international public opinion through appeal and interaction. The fact that countries have soft power, not just hard power. And when we map all those measures, and within those measures we have about 126 indicators, and within that we have 25 countries, so that adds up to about 30,000 different data points that we've aggregated, and we do this exercise on an annual basis, so it's a very time-consuming process. When we add up all those variables, we think that the distribution of power looks something like this, and that is to say that the US remains the dominant player, but that China has now firmly established itself as a peer competitor to the US. The US maintains a 10-point lead or a 10-point advantage, some degree of primacy over China. And this is because even as China rises and has established itself as the engine of Factory Asia, you can see here, those are the 25 countries that we look at. Yes, and here we're looking at economic relationships. So the fact that China has established itself as the engine of Factory Asia is really the source of its international power. But its power, China's power, remains hobbled in key respects. Beijing has a lot of distrustful neighbors. It has 11 neighbors with whom it has either unresolved boundary disputes or legacies of interstate conflict with. That causes a trust deficit in the region for China. It certainly doesn't have the defense clout that the United States brings to the picture. So if you look at defense networks, have a look at how big the United States is here. America has an unparalleled network of allies in our region, and it also brings soft power to the equation as the biggest influencer in terms of exports of cultural goods and services into the region. So if you look at cultural influence here, have a look at how big the US is there. And by that we mean the fact is that when people in Asia consume foreign media, they tend to read American media. So we tend to understand world events through American lenses rather than through reading Chinese media. And that has an important way of how we interpret world events, that it's influential. The day that we start reading China Daily every morning to understand the ins and outs of the White House, we could talk about living in a sort of Chinese-dominated sphere of influence. But the fact that we still consume English media in a relatively free and robust media landscape gives the US a decisive advantage in terms of how information is conveyed in the region. So there are hard and soft qualities to 20th century US power, and those endure into the early 21st century. And I would argue they're rooted in a working system of cooperation, of partnership, and of alliances. But also it's premised, US power is premised on the US maintaining its role as a multilateral player in our region. This is not just a two-player game. If you look at how countries perform in terms of how they do in terms of their resources, which are the four measures on the left-hand side: economic resources, military capability, resilience, and future trends. And then their influence, which is what they do with the resources in terms of diplomatic influence, economic relationships. We find that the second-tier countries do better than we'd expect them to. So let me illustrate that point here. Again, I apologize for how data heavy this is, but if you want to interrupt me at any points, please do. There is a general correlation between a country's size and the degree of influence that it holds in our region. That is to say, if you've got a larger economy, we would expect you to do better in terms of your economic relationships, in terms of driving investment and trade into the region. But that correlation doesn't hold for all countries in the same way. Some countries are underperformers. That is to say, our model would expect them to do better than they should, than they do. And other countries are overperformers. That is to say, they have more influence than their size and resources suggest according to our model. So let's have a look at the biggest players. You see on the far right-hand side, China and the United States there. China is an underachiever, which is to say it's large, it's developing, it's rising, but it still doesn't have the influence that we would expect it to, given its size. The US is just on the line, so it's just where we'd expect it to be. But the biggest overachievers tend to be middle powers like Japan, like Australia, like South Korea, like Singapore. Singapore, a city-state of 5.6 million people. The fact that it can do so well is because it is highly networked, externally focused, driving trade, but also works in concert with other middle powers to pursue shared interests on the world stage. So that's a key ability of middle powers, is their kind of willingness and their ability to coordinate their actions on the international stage, and that creates sort of a force multiplier effect. Middle powers are strongest when they work together. By contrast, some of the underachievers tend to be powerful in their own right, but they tend to be more unilateral players. So we actually have, well, this is Singapore there. Let me just move. Russia, a big underachiever in our region. This is the Asia Power Index, I should say. So we're not looking at Russia's influence in Europe or in the Middle East. We're looking at Russia's influence in Asia. And what we can say is that Russia is an underachiever. It has some degree of military capability. It maintains its Pacific fleet in Vladivostok, which is next to North Korea. But it's basically not very economically and diplomatically engaged overall, certainly relative to its overall size. North Korea is another underachiever. You might say, look, I mean, it's a plucky overachiever. Perhaps it is, but it's not. It doesn't have broad-based multilateral influence. It's a diplomatic outcast. There are sanctions against it. It has a GDP that's smaller than Laos, even though Laos, one of the poorest countries in Southeast Asia, has a quarter of the population of North Korea. The point is, North Korea is an asymmetric power, also a highly debilitated power, and for our purposes at least, is still an underachiever. So, just to suggest, this is more than a two-player game. There is more than just the US and China involved here when it comes to the geopolitics of Asia. And in fact, the smaller players, the middle players, tend to be those that are the biggest overachievers. But all this is coming under strain, not just because of the increased assertiveness, the sharpening ambitions of China, but also because of what's happened to US political leadership in our region. President Donald Trump has made clear that multilateralism is not necessarily his priority. And when we asked a sample group of policymakers and experts in the region, they ranked the US leader 13th in the region in terms of his ability to advance the US's diplomatic interests. This is for 2017. So if we look at that here, look at how small the United States becomes for political leadership. And I would argue that others have filled the void. And it's not just China, because that's what everyone expects, that China would fill the void. But actually, surprisingly, Japan has led the way in terms of political leadership. And I would argue, again, this sort of conforms to the idea that middle powers are working harder than they ever have before to maintain their comparative advantages. One example of that is how Japan was able to resuscitate something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the free trade agreement which the US had initiated, but then it withdrew from that because it didn't believe in free trade or multilateral free trade agreements anymore. And the initiative was revived by Japan, by Singapore, by Australia, and a number of others. And they were able to actually push that through last year. And really what we see is that middle powers are having to do more in the absence of US leadership. Nevertheless, I think we are moving in a world defined by mercantilism, by zero-sum politics as opposed to positive-sum politics. We're talking about the idea that it's every man for themselves, that there is going to be more of a technological arms race between the largest players, and that things like the role of technology becomes much more important, but also international leverage. By that we mean the role of the US dollar, for example, or the fact that China brings a lot of state-directed investment diplomacy into the region. It has state-owned enterprises which are driving investment decisions. And so the point is that there's this kind of marriage between economics and geopolitics, which may even be moving in the direction of a new Cold War. So let's assume that we are moving in that direction. We have to then rethink some of our assumptions, some of the weighting strategy used in this index. And that's what we've done here. So let's have a look. This is what we think the distribution of power looks like under a rules-based order that is more or less ticking along. That is to say, it's coming under strain in the South China Sea and elsewhere. But broadly speaking, US global leadership is intact. And the alliances that the US has formed over the last 5 decades hold. And what we see is that the US maintains a narrowing but still prominent degree of primacy in our region, and that some of the US's key allies like Japan, like Australia and South Korea figure in the top 10. Now, what would happen under a Cold War, particularly in a situation where the US renounces its multilateral advantages, where it doesn't care so much for alliances, where it becomes much more of a unilateral player? And by our assessments at least, we think that the US would actually lose its comparative advantage as a multilateral player, and that China gains in a world defined by raw heft as opposed to rules-based globalism. Not only would China gain, but a number of smaller trade-dependent countries would also move down in the rankings. So if you look at Singapore, Malaysia there, they move down in the rankings. I should say this is all hypothetical. This is a scenario here. Japan moves down as well, but I will lay out why I think that is the case. I mean, a number of other countries do well, like India and Indonesia move up in the rankings, and we think that basically the larger a country you are, the more self-sustaining a country's economy is in terms of its domestic consumption driving economic growth as opposed to outward trade, the more insulated they would be from a new Cold War. Now, that rests on 3 assumptions. The first is that we're talking about a paralysis in economic governance. What do we mean by that? There would be no lowest common denominator anymore other than the agreement to disagree between countries. And we've seen signs of this at the G7, we've seen signs of this at the latest APEC summit, if you saw, which took place in Papua New Guinea. Essentially, world leaders were unable to come up with a diplomatic communique, so that's the statement that they produced at the end of the summit, simply because they just couldn't agree on anything. The only thing they agreed on was the fact that they disagreed. And things could get a lot worse. So by the end of this year, the rules-based trading system built around the World Trade Organization could wither, if not crack, under pressure. And that's because by December, there will only be 1 judge left on the WTO's appellate body, which is responsible for international trade law enforcement. And that means that international trade law enforcement will go into limbo, and that will affect a lot of smaller trade-dependent countries. Why is that the case? Because this agreement between the US and China is so protracted that the US has basically felt that it can't nominate new judges on the World Trade Organization. It doesn't believe anymore in maintaining a system which it sees has unfairly benefited China. So the WTO is badly in need of reform, but there's loggerheads there, they're at loggerheads, and as a result, the entire system may well crack under pressure. Now, the second assumption I'm making is that the United States is serious about pursuing what's been called economic decoupling. What do we mean by economic decoupling between the world's two largest economies? It means a kind of reversion of globalization, such that the US disentangles itself from companies and supply chains and technologies based in China. The US wants to do less and less with China. It's worried about China as a security threat, as a spying threat, but also it wants to avoid contributing to the rise of China as a sort of tech superpower. Now, we've actually modeled what that would look like over the course of the next decade. I should say this is all available online. This is our weightings calculator, so if you want to play around with the relative importance of our measures to produce your own rankings, so you can do that, and that's how we've come up with our different scenarios. But let me just move on. This is a chart that looks at the GDP, so there's the economic output of the US and China from 2005. And what we see is that the US is doing moderately well, that China is catching up. And then we've actually split the charts into two directions. One would be under current business as usual trends, and the other one would be under a new Cold War trend. So the solid line is what would happen, we think, under business as usual, which is that China's economy would become about as big as the US by 2030, would level the United States by 2030. The dotted line, which you may or may not be able to see from this distance, which is the line underneath the solid line, is what would happen to both economies if the US and China pursued what's known as economic decoupling, disentangled each other's companies from each other's economies, and basically had less and less to do with each other, economically speaking at least. That would hurt both, but it would hurt China slightly more than the US. It would produce a hit equivalent to about 3.5% of China's GDP, which is roughly the domestic value that China gains from exports it does to the United States. It would also hit the US, but in a Trumpian sort of beggar thy neighbor sense, China would lose out more. By 2030, China's economy would be approximately 8% smaller, or $2.7 trillion smaller than forecast under normal trends. The US would only be $1.1 trillion smaller or poorer, with an economy that's 3% smaller than currently forecast for 2030. But my point here is that China's overall growth trajectory, what you see here in terms of the line sort of accelerating upwards, will not be fundamentally affected. You can slow, but you can't reverse China's rise as an economic power. And at best, you could probably retard China leveling with the United States' economy by 2 or 3 years, but it doesn't really give you all that much time. And the reason is that Beijing is actually less vulnerable to escalating trade tensions than many believe, certainly that many in the White House believe. China has become the world's largest trading nation, but counterintuitively, its GDP has become less dependent on exports. Why is that important? So we can have a look. The back end of our website allows you to sort of see all these individual data points. And what we see is that China's dependency on global trade is about 37%. That's its trade to GDP ratio. For the US, it's about 27%. But these are the world's two largest trading nations, but they also have very large domestic economies. So most of their economic prosperity is now derived from domestic sources, and those domestic sources of economic growth are insulating them against headwinds in the global economy. Whereas smaller economies like, let's go here to, I'm not sure if we can actually, smaller economies like Vietnam, for example, have trade to GDP ratios that are over 200%. So they're much more susceptible to disruptions in global trade than is China. And that means that the region, which is strategically friendly to the United States, probably has more to lose from a trade war than China itself. So the collateral damage here in decoupling and a trade war between the US and China is quite high. Similarly, in the technological arms race between the US and China, there's a concern in the West that China may at some point start to surpass the US in terms of artificial intelligence, in terms of the rise of biotech and information technology. Look, that may or may not happen. We don't know. But China's success or failure will have little to do with its access to Western markets. Even if Western markets close themselves off to Chinese tech, as we have done in Australia in terms of Huawei, because we're protecting ourselves from the security risks posed by Chinese companies accessing our latest 5G markets. Even if we do that in the West, it will probably not disrupt the rise of Chinese tech. Why do I say that? I say that because if you look at Huawei's sales or its revenue growth over the last 5 years, it's all come from China itself. It's come from domestic sources of growth, and then it's come from the Middle East and Asia. It's come from developing markets. It's not really coming from the US. It's not coming from the Americas, where it's only seen 5% growth. The point is the world is more and more driven by growth in developing markets, no longer the West. And Chinese tech has a future in developing markets, even if it has no future in the West. So we will not be able to stop, I think, China's rise as a tech superpower in the next decade or so. Now, the third assumption I'm making is that middle powers, particularly in Asia, will assert some form of autonomy between the US and China. In other words, there will not be fixed blocks in a new economic Cold War. Why do I say that? Well, the reason is quite simple. China does about 70% more trade with our region than does the United States. And for major industrialized allies of the United States, like Japan, like South Korea, like ourselves, decoupling plus America first is a bit of a toxic recipe. We want to see our ties with China managed, but not necessarily severed. Managed, but not severed. I think that's the crucial distinction here. Now, the US has a range of carrots and sticks it can deploy in this so-called economic Cold War. It could promise to relocate supply chains out of China and invest them in new emerging markets. And we've already seen some countries benefit from that. So Vietnam and Taiwan, for example. It also has sticks. So for example, in the newest renegotiated free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, the United States has included something called a poison pill clause, colloquially, and that is the idea that if either of those two countries, Mexico or Canada, were to pursue free trade negotiations with China, that the US would have the right to rescind their free trade agreement. So that's the sort of way of disincentivizing the US's economic partners from integrating themselves more with China's economy. However, I would suggest a focus on securing bilateral trade deals and on balancing trade flows one country at a time, which has been Trump's focus, is not necessarily going to stem China's influence. China is simply too big. Far from containing China, forcing choices from third countries may ensure that global supply chains remain anchored in China after all. So we have to think about the unintended consequences of pursuing kind of a unilateral Cold War and insisting that third countries make choices, because it may not work in our favor or in the favor of the United States. There is another sort of rather complicated way of looking at that, which is simply, this is a chart that looks at where final consumption for East Asian exports is coming from over time. And in 2003, I think more than half of all final consumption for East Asian exports was still driven by Western economies. That is to say, Europe, the US, and a number of others. But by 2017, 2/3 of East Asian exports is now consumed by East Asia itself, that is to say by consumers in China and other non-Western economies. our sort of leverage as Western economies is declining within the global economy. So if we want to try to split the global economy, it may well be that China's gravitational clout only becomes stronger, not weaker. So we have to be careful. Now, let's take this back to military trends here, because all of this is sort of interconnected. The economics is interconnected with the military stuff, with the cultural influence, with the economic relationships, with the resilience of countries and the rest. But here's a bit of a global history since 2005 of defense spending trends. And what we see is that China has climbed the ranks, but not as drastically as it's been able to catch up with the US in terms of its GDP. Despite slower movement in the rankings, we would still expect 4 out of the top 5 military spenders globally by 2023 to be in the Indo-Pacific region. So really, this region is ground zero for great power relations globally. And as I say, we cannot really preclude the possibility that an economic Cold War turns into a hot war. There are plenty of examples in history of confrontations which have started in economic terms and which have then escalated into physical conflict. So at the moment, one of the hallmarks of the modern era has been that defense spending as a percent of GDP remains stable. So defense spending is going up. Countries are spending more on their military, but that remains commensurate with their economic growth. They're not spending a greater percent of their GDP on military expenditure. For China, that's about 1.9%. For the US, it's actually gone down. It was about 4.5% during the height of the war on terror. It's now 3.6%. So more or less, countries are allocating about the same amount of money, or about the same proportion of their overall economy to military expenditure over the last several decades. And under those conditions, I think the US would still enjoy a decisive military advantage if we think about the military balance of power in Asia. So let's have a look at military capability here. There's a 30-point difference between the US and China. And it's not just the fact that the US has more defense spending, more defense assets, more sophisticated signature capabilities, but also, again, it comes down to the fact that the US has this enormous alliance network, which is unmatched in our region and globally, really. And at the same time, I'd say other regional players are essentially hedging against the rise of China, the military rise of China, by pursuing more non-allied partnerships. What we mean by that is they may not be signing mutual defense treaties with each other, but they're certainly doing a hell of a lot more joint training exercises. They're doing more defense dialogues with each other. Their arms transfers, so the arms trades that they do, the arms trade that they do between each other suggests that strategic partnerships are really thickening. And we would go so far as to say that this is actually China's Achilles heel in our region. If you look at, so here's the sort of non-allied partnerships. China is very low down on this list. It's number 8. Whereas countries like Singapore, like Australia, like Malaysia are doing a lot more. And so I would think that actually China is looking very isolated if you think about the landscape of defense diplomacy in our region. So what would this do in terms of our scenarios? We had a look at the economic Cold War scenario, and now let's have a look at what a hot war, who stands to be in the best position in the event of an outbreak of outright conflict in our region. So this is premised on the idea that there would be a maritime conflict in East Asia, and that this would take place in the near future. And what we see is that the US maintains a commanding advantage. Countries with underdeveloped military power, however, like Japan, would be much more vulnerable. And ironically, you might have noticed by now that New Zealand crops up in the top 10. This is not a mistake from our model. This is actually to do with the fact that New Zealand has geography on its side. The further removed you are from the physical conflict, the more friends and fish surround you, the more in some ways that you could endure a conflict, and that's exactly what New Zealand has to its advantage. The more in the middle of the action a country finds itself, like Japan, the more that its energy and trade security would be compromised in the event of a conflict.
Put the date on that screen.
Sorry?
What's the date of that?
This is from January this year. We ran this scenario in January this year.
And I presume it doesn't take into account nuclear war.
Yes, this is a maritime conflict in East Asia, not nuclear. And it's and what we're not suggesting that these countries would win or would prevail. We're just saying that these countries would be most capable to endure a conflict and to advance their interests in such a way that outcomes would be favorable to themselves. Now, so under current trends, I think the US maintains its military dominance in Asia. If we look at future trends here, which is military expenditure in 2030, this is another projection. We think that the US maintains its lead and that, however, assumes that China's ratio of defense spending to GDP remains largely unchanged. So that means that we've projected this on the basis that China doesn't spend more than 1.9% of its GDP on military expenditure between now and 2030. If that's the case, the US maintains its decisive advantage in terms of military expenditure and also military capability. But under a period of building and prolonged tension, we have to factor in the possibility, at least, that China may in fact ramp up its defense spending from an estimated 1.9% currently to something over 4% of GDP. And that would be closer to Cold War level defense spending. And sadly, under this scenario, China may actually have more fiscal headspace to catch up with the United States. So let's have a look. This is military expenditure levels in absolute terms. And then you see the little tags there which show what the percent of GDP is being spent on military expenditure. For China, things remain quite level. The solid line is 1.9%, and for the US, it's at 3.5%. Now, under conditions of a new Cold War, where both countries decide to ramp up their defense spending under a prolonged period of building military tension in our region, I would think that China could actually accelerate its defense spending and almost level the US if it allocates something like 4.3% of its GDP to military expenditure. And that factors in the costs of a new economic Cold War as well. So the scenario I was showing you before, which was the fact that China's economy would be 8% smaller by 2030, that already factors those economic figures in. And even under those conditions, I would think that China could actually rapidly accelerate and nearly level the US's global military expenditure. So, long-term political will and defense economics will be deciding factors in the military rivalry between the peer competitors. And let's keep in mind that the US also has global commitments, not just regional commitments, even if it is increasingly skeptical of those commitments, whereas China really can afford to concentrate its military assets on its near abroad. And that means it has a slight comparative advantage over the US in its kind of immediate periphery. So I will conclude this presentation on 3 points. I might actually, if we have time allowing, but I'm not sure how we're doing on time, I might speak to the US a little bit, but I think, Australia. But let me just say three things before I conclude. I don't think the US will necessarily be able to prevent China's emergence as a peer competitor. But that doesn't mean that China will replace the US as an undisputed unipolar power. There's a difference between leveling with the US and replacing the US as a global power. In fact, so I think in some sense the United States and the West as a whole will have to learn to live with China and think carefully about the aggravating consequences, the unintended consequences of how we compete with China economically and militarily. If the US pursues a new Cold War strategy unilaterally through zero-sum politics rather than shoring up the interests of its allies, I think that could actually only accelerate those aggravating consequences. Second, I think the US and perhaps the West more broadly will have to find a way to live with China by playing to our strengths as multilateral players. That would create a system that's more conducive to the collective strengths of the US and its allies in such a way that our collective interests are maximized. That would produce a much more favorable balance of power than if the US went up against China by itself unilaterally. And third, I think, yes, China will continue to chip away at America's margin of preeminence, but let's also keep in mind this is not just a two-player game. There are other Asian powers on the rise, notably India. India's rise will mean that New Delhi will start chipping away at the relativities of Beijing's power, particularly as China starts to age, because China's working age population is set to decline by 158 million people in less than 30 years. So there are huge challenges confronting China as well. So we just have to think carefully about how we manage great power competition. I think I'll leave it at that. I've probably already spent too long presenting. Thanks very much.
Questions, ladies and gentlemen.